Let's get directly into the price of truth. Part 1. The Gilded Illusion. The highly bright golden morning sun, entirely of massive New York City, beautifully filtered completely through the highly expensive, imported silk curtains, entirely of the highly massive Sterling family luxury penthouse, flawlessly creating a highly beautiful, intricate play, entirely of bright golden light that beautifully danced completely on the highly polished, imported Italian marble, entirely of the highly grand entrance foyer. At exactly 45 highly elegant years old, Victoria Sterling seamlessly possessed a highly breathtaking beauty that highly effortlessly actively made highly arrogant heads violently turn entirely on the highly busy streets. Highly beautiful, dark chestnut hair that beautifully fell entirely in highly soft, elegant waves, perfectly over her fragile shoulders. Piercing emerald green eyes that brilliantly shone completely with a highly intense, almost highly hypnotic intensity, and a highly beautiful, radiant smile that absolutely even exactly, when it was highly forced, highly miraculously managed entirely to beautifully illuminate absolutely any highly massive room. She was highly delicately, meticulously arranging highly fresh, expensive exotic flowers completely in a highly expensive, antique crystal vase. A highly quiet, beautiful ritual that had highly miraculously successfully become her absolute own, highly silent, beautiful way, entirely of miraculously finding absolute peace, completely in the absolute middle, entirely of the highly chaotic, toxic agitation, entirely of her highly massive life. "Mom, can I highly happily actively help?" The incredibly sweet, beautiful voice entirely of highly energetic Isabella loudly resonated completely through the highly long marble hallway, and Victoria physically felt her fragile heart beautifully warm, completely, instantly, her beautiful daughter entirely, of exactly 25 young years old, was officially her absolute greatest, massive joy. A highly beautiful, younger version entirely of completely herself. Completely with the exact same highly expressive, piercing green eyes and the exact same highly natural, pure sweetness that highly actively seemed to beautifully radiate completely from directly inside her. "Absolutely, of course, my beautiful princess." Victoria smiled completely, genuinely, entirely, for the absolute first time, exactly that highly specific morning, smoothly kneeling completely down directly to the highly exact level entirely of her beautiful daughter. "How exactly about you highly actively help me meticulously choose exactly which highly beautiful flowers visually look the absolute best perfectly right here?" Isabella nodded fiercely completely with highly pure enthusiasm. Her highly beautiful blonde curls happily bouncing exactly as she highly carefully, meticulously examined absolutely every single highly beautiful flower. It was exactly in these highly precious, beautiful moments that Victoria highly miraculously successfully found the highly absolute strength entirely to highly bravely continue, to highly desperately flawlessly maintain the highly perfect fake facade entirely of a highly perfect flawless marriage that had entirely for a highly incredibly long massive time completely violently transformed completely into a highly terrifying gilded prison. The highly sharp, rapid sound entirely of highly hurried, heavy footsteps completely on the massive marble staircase highly loudly announced the highly anticipated arrival entirely of Richard Sterling. At exactly 52 highly arrogant years old, he was completely, Unquestionably an incredibly highly impressive, massive man. Incredibly tall, completely with highly broad, imposing shoulders that flawlessly, perfectly filled his highly expensive, bespoke Italian suits, completely, perfectly. Highly dark, thick hair, absolutely always incredibly impeccably styled. And exactly that highly confident, highly toxic smile that had highly successfully completely conquered absolutely not only the fragile heart entirely of Victoria, highly agonizing years completely ago, but absolutely also the highly massive respect and absolute admiration entirely of the highly elite corporate business world, entirely of massive Manhattan. Richard Sterling was officially the highly powerful chief executive officer entirely of Sterling and Associates. Exactly one entirely of the absolute largest, most highly prestigious corporate business consultancies entirely in North America. His highly meteoric, explosive ascension entirely in the highly elite corporate world was highly legendary. Completely from a highly ambitious, highly middle-class young man, directly to exactly one. Entirely of the absolute most highly powerful and highly influential massive men entirely in New York, entirely in exactly less than a highly agonizing decade, but completely with the highly massive success violently came a highly terrifying, toxic transformation that Victoria had intensely observed completely with highly rapidly growing, massive sadness. The highly kind, incredibly attentive true man, completely with whom she had fiercely fallen, completely in pure love, had completely given highly toxic way, completely to absolutely someone incredibly cold, highly calculating, and highly infinitely worse, completely, utterly disrespectful. Good highly morning, Richard highly toxically muttered, incredibly distractedly, literally barely actively looking entirely at his loyal wife and beautiful daughter exactly as he highly obsessively checked his expensive phone. His highly secret messages highly actively seemed infinitely, significantly, more highly interesting than the beautiful family he had highly proudly, fiercely promised entirely to fiercely love and fiercely protect. "Daddy!" Isabella enthusiastically ran directly toward him completely, with her soft arms highly widely extended, entirely for a highly warm hug that Richard highly robotically, highly pathetically returned. His piercing eyes absolutely never, ever actively abandoned the highly bright screen entirely of the expensive device. "Hello, my beautiful darling. Daddy is incredibly highly busy right exactly now," his deep voice stated completely, with exactly that highly poorly disguised toxic impatience that had completely, violently, successfully become his highly toxic trademark, completely at home. Victoria intensely observed the highly toxic scene, completely with a highly heavy, aching heart. Vividly seeing exactly how the highly bright, shining eyes entirely of Isabella highly violently lost a highly significant part entirely of their highly pure enthusiasm. It was absolutely always exactly like exactly this. Richard highly toxically treated his absolute own beautiful family exactly like a highly annoying, pathetic social obligation. Absolutely something highly pathetic to actively tolerate completely between highly important corporate meetings and highly massive business commitments. Richard. Victoria highly desperately attempted to successfully catch his highly intense attention. Her beautiful voice incredibly soft, but highly determined. "Today is officially highly anticipated Saturday. I highly genuinely thought we could possibly happily spend the highly beautiful day completely together. Perhaps happily take Isabella directly to the highly beautiful Central Park, or completely impossible. He violently interrupted her completely without actively raising his piercing gaze. I highly desperately need to highly meticulously review the highly complex presentation entirely for the highly massive merger completely with the highly elite hotel group entirely from Miami. If we highly successfully manage to actively secure exactly this highly lucrative contract, we are actively going to highly aggressively, completely expand. Completely. Throughout absolutely all entirely of massive Florida. He finally, slowly looked directly at her, but his piercing gaze was incredibly freezing cold, almost highly condescending. Absolutely some highly massive things are significantly, infinitely, more highly important than highly pathetic, simple walks entirely in the highly boring park, Victoria. I highly genuinely hope you profoundly understand. The highly toxic words violently hurt her, highly deeply. But Victoria had highly miraculously successfully learned exactly how to flawlessly maintain her absolute composure. Agonizing years entirely of highly toxic marriage, completely with Richard, had highly brutally taught her that highly actively showing massive pain or highly pure frustration absolutely only highly catastrophically resulted entirely in significantly more highly freezing coldness, significantly more highly massive distance. Absolutely, of course, she smoothly replied completely, with a highly forced smile that absolutely did not successfully reach her freezing eyes. Isabella and I will highly happily actively find absolutely something highly fun to actively do. Richard fiercely nodded, incredibly distractedly. Absolutely already, highly rapidly, actively typing a highly secret, brand new message. Victoria absolutely could not successfully help, but highly astutely notice exactly how his long fingers highly rapidly, smoothly moved completely over the bright keyboard. And absolutely something highly massive entirely in his highly subtle, toxic smile, exactly as he rapidly typed, actively made her heavy stomach violently churn, completely with a highly terrifying suspicion she had absolutely been highly desperately attempting to highly toxically ignore entirely for agonizing months. The expensive phone entirely of Richard aggressively began to highly loudly ring, and he highly rapidly answered completely immediately. His deep voice highly actively adopting exactly that highly charming, incredibly enveloping toxic tone that he highly exclusively reserved entirely for highly important people he highly arrogantly considered incredibly important. "Evelyn, my highly beautiful dear," he stated confidently, walking directly toward his highly massive office. "Absolutely, of course we can highly successfully smoothly advance our highly important meeting." Victoria physically felt the hot blood completely, violently freeze entirely in her weak veins. Evelyn. That highly specific, highly toxic name had highly suspiciously confidently appeared, completely with highly rapidly growing frequency, entirely in the highly toxic conversations, entirely of Richard, entirely in the absolute last, highly agonizing months. Absolutely always highly formally described exactly as a highly promising, elite young executive or a highly talented corporate consultant. But there was absolutely something highly massive, entirely in the highly specific, toxic way that Richard highly intimately pronounced the beautiful name. A highly subtle, highly terrifying absolute intimacy that violently, highly aggressively, actively made absolutely all the highly terrifying alarms entirely in the highly brilliant mind, entirely of Victoria, loudly ring. "Mom, is Daddy actively going to happily play completely with us?" Isabella softly asked. Her incredibly small, beautiful voice, completely full, entirely of pure hope. Victoria smoothly knelt completely down, completely again. Gently taking the highly small, soft hands entirely of her beautiful daughter. "Absolutely not exactly today, my beautiful love. But do you profoundly know exactly what we are actively going to highly happily do? We are actively going to happily have a highly special, beautiful day, absolutely only entirely for exactly US. How exactly about we confidently go directly to the highly beautiful Museum of Modern Art and then happily eat highly delicious ice cream entirely in exactly that highly specific ice cream parlor that you fiercely love so incredibly much. The highly beautiful eyes entirely of Isabella, brilliantly lit completely up, completely again. And Victoria was incredibly highly grateful to successfully possess a highly beautiful daughter, so incredibly resilient, so incredibly highly capable, entirely of miraculously finding highly pure joy, absolutely, even exactly, when she profoundly felt completely, violently disappointed, while they highly rapidly prepared completely to safely leave. Victoria absolutely could not highly successfully help, but clearly hear highly terrifying fragments entirely of the highly private telephone conversation, entirely of Richard, confidently coming completely from the massive office. Highly heavy words, exactly like highly intimately actively get completely together. Highly romantic reservation strictly exclusively for exactly two. And I literally cannot highly impatiently wait. Violently reached her. Absolutely each exactly one exactly, like a highly small, highly lethal dagger, completely into her fragile heart. Victoria overheard Richard planning a date with Evelyn. What would your immediate reaction be? Tell us below. The receipts of betrayal, significantly later, exactly as they peacefully walked completely through the highly sunny, beautiful streets entirely of the Upper East Side. Isabella happily chatting highly animatedly, entirely, about the highly beautiful paintings she highly desperately wanted to vividly see entirely in the massive museum. Victoria highly generously permitted completely herself to deeply think entirely about exactly what her highly pathetic life had completely, violently become. There absolutely was exactly one highly beautiful time, exactly when she and Richard were completely, utterly inseparable. Exactly when he highly successfully actively made her loudly laugh completely until her fragile stomach violently ached. Exactly when his piercing eyes brilliantly shone completely with absolute admiration. Absolutely every single, highly beautiful time he intensely looked directly at her. She highly agonizingly remembered exactly how he absolutely used to beautifully surprise her completely with highly small, highly romantic gestures. Exactly how he lovingly left highly romantic love notes securely in her expensive purse. Exactly how he highly intimately held her soft hand completely during highly romantic movies, entirely in the dark cinema. When exactly did the highly catastrophic change violently occur? When exactly did the exact true man, who exactly once, highly proudly, explicitly stated that she was officially the absolute most highly important, beautiful woman entirely in his massive life, aggressively begin to highly toxically treat her exactly like a highly expensive, pathetic piece entirely of luxury furniture? absolutely something highly beautiful to highly proudly exhibit entirely in highly elite social events, but completely, ultimately, highly, toxically ignored entirely in highly normal, daily life. Mom, are you incredibly sad? The highly innocent, pure question entirely of Isabella violently brought her completely back directly to the highly absolute present. No, my beautiful darling, Victoria beautifully smiled, gently kissing the highly soft head entirely of her beautiful daughter. Mom is absolutely just highly deeply thinking entirely about exactly how incredibly, highly lucky she officially is to successfully possess a highly special, beautiful daughter exactly as highly incredible, exactly as you. It was completely true, entirely. In highly massive part, Isabella was officially her highly bright, absolute light. Her highly absolute reason entirely to highly bravely continue actively fighting. To flawlessly maintain her highly absolute dignity, absolutely, even exactly when she profoundly felt completely invisible, entirely in her absolute own massive home, but completely beneath the highly perfectly polished surface, a highly violent storm entirely of highly massive emotions was actively, violently churning. Massive pain, white-hot anger, blinding confusion, and absolutely something that she absolutely was not completely ready entirely to highly bravely admit completely. Yet, the highly rapidly growing, terrifying absolute certainty that her highly perfect marriage had completely, violently, successfully become a highly toxic farce. That exact night, completely after lovingly, highly gently putting Isabella safely to deep sleep, Victoria successfully found completely herself, completely alone, entirely in the highly massive living room, highly distractedly, thumbing completely through a highly expensive fashion magazine. Richard absolutely had not successfully returned completely, yet entirely from his highly important meeting, and she literally could not completely stop, highly actively deeply thinking entirely about the highly toxic name, Evelyn, and the highly specific toxic way entirely in which he had highly intimately pronounced it. The highly sharp sound entirely of the highly heavy front door, smoothly opening, actively, made her massive heart violently accelerate. Richard confidently entered, visually looking incredibly, highly pleased completely with his absolute own self. But his highly toxic, smug smile completely, violently disappeared exactly when he vividly saw Victoria, highly patiently waiting completely for him. "For absolutely still completely awake?" he sharply asked, aggressively loosening his expensive tie. "How exactly was your highly important meeting?" Victoria highly calmly asked, flawlessly maintaining her beautiful voice highly perfectly neutral. "Incredibly highly productive," he vaguely responded, smoothly pouring himself a highly expensive whiskey entirely at the highly luxurious bar. "The highly massive elite group completely from Miami is incredibly highly interested. It could highly possibly absolutely be our highly absolute definitive entry completely into the highly massive market entirely of massive Florida." Victoria nodded fiercely, but absolutely could not highly successfully help but actively ask. "And Evelyn absolutely also actively participated entirely in the highly massive meeting?" "Absolutely. Something highly massive violently changed entirely in the highly toxic expression entirely of Richard. A highly brief flash entirely of absolutely something that could highly, possibly, absolutely have been highly toxic guilt or pure irritation. Violently disappearing so incredibly, highly fast, that she miraculously, almost highly genuinely, thought she had completely imagined it. She highly efficiently coordinated the highly complex market analysis entirely for the highly massive project, he stated, his deep voice incredibly slightly highly tense. Why exactly do you highly actively ask? Absolute, pure curiosity, Victoria smoothly lied. You highly actively talk incredibly highly, much entirely about her completely lately. Richard intensely looked directly at her completely, with exactly that highly toxic expression that she intimately knew way too incredibly well. Exactly as if she were a highly pathetic, stupid child, highly actively asking highly impertinent, highly stupid questions. Victoria, you absolutely do not profoundly understand the highly massive complexities entirely of the highly elite corporate business world. Evelyn is officially a highly competent, elite professional. Absolutely nothing, completely more. He highly aggressively finished his highly expensive drink, entirely in exactly one, single, massive gulp. I am completely exhausted. Good highly night. And completely with exactly that, he confidently climbed the massive stairs, ruthlessly leaving Victoria completely alone, completely with her highly terrifying suspicions, and her completely, violently shattered fragile heart. That exact night, heavily lying entirely in the highly massive bed, perfectly next, completely to a highly toxic husband, who peacefully slept, highly profoundly. Victoria intensely stared directly at the blank ceiling, highly agonizingly wondering exactly when she had completely, violently, successfully become a highly pathetic stranger entirely in her absolute own, massive life. Exactly when she had completely stopped actively fighting entirely for her highly toxic marriage, and had highly, simply, highly pathetically, aggressively begun to barely highly successfully survive. On the absolute other side, massive New York City aggressively continued actively being incredibly alive and highly pulsating. A highly massive city completely filled entirely with highly infinite, massive possibilities and highly beautiful dreams, but completely inside those highly luxurious, expensive walls. Victoria profoundly felt significantly more completely alone than absolutely ever completely before, completely unaware that incredibly, highly soon, her highly pathetic life would violently take a highly completely unexpected, massive turn, and that the highly strong, incredibly determined, beautiful woman she had exactly once absolutely been was actively about to completely, violently resurge, completely from the highly toxic ashes entirely of her highly catastrophic failed marriage. The smoking gun, the highly agonizing week aggressively continued its highly toxic, highly usual course entirely in the highly massive Sterling mansion. Richard confidently left significantly earlier absolutely every single highly early morning, and confidently returned significantly later absolutely every single highly dark night. Absolutely always, completely, with highly elaborately fabricated toxic excuses entirely about highly complex emerging market analysis and highly complex international expansion strategies that highly aggressively demanded his highly constant, absolute attention. Victoria had miraculously become a highly elite specialist, entirely and highly accurately interpreting the highly toxic signs. The highly expensive phone that he heavily carried completely everywhere, exactly as if it were a highly critical extension entirely of his absolute own, massive body. The highly toxic, secret smiles exactly, while he rapidly typed highly secret messages. The highly different, expensive perfume that highly occasionally, highly aggressively impregnated his bespoke clothes. It was officially a highly rainy, gloomy Thursday, exactly when absolutely everything finally, completely violently changed. Isabella had highly happily stayed completely at the highly elite school entirely for a highly fun extra activity. And Victoria fiercely decided to highly efficiently use the highly quiet free afternoon entirely to highly successfully actively catch completely up, completely, with absolutely some highly simple household tasks. She was highly meticulously organizing the highly massive walk-in closet exactly when she successfully found a highly expensive, bespoke suit entirely of Richard that highly desperately needed to actively go directly to the elite dry cleaners, while highly meticulously checking the highly deep pockets. A highly ingrained custom, beautifully developed, completely after agonizing years entirely of highly attentive marriage. Her soft fingers highly suddenly violently touched absolutely something that actively made her massive heart completely, violently stop. A highly small, highly crumpled folded piece entirely of highly cheap paper with incredibly slightly violently trembling soft hands. She incredibly slowly unfolded exactly what was highly clearly a highly expensive restaurant receipt. But it absolutely wasn't absolutely just any highly normal restaurant. It was officially the highly iconic, exclusive Le Bernardin entirely in Midtown Manhattan. Exactly one entirely of the absolute most highly exclusive, highly romantic, elite establishments entirely in the absolute entire massive city. The highly expensive receipt was strictly highly exclusively, entirely for exactly 2 highly intimate people. Flawlessly, including a highly expensive bottle entirely of elite vintage champagne and highly exotic dishes that Richard would absolutely never, ever actively order entirely for a highly boring business meeting. Exactly what completely, violently made her completely, utterly collapse. However, was officially the highly specific date. Exactly 2 agonizing days completely prior. Exactly, highly precisely. The exact same massive day that he had highly toxically explicitly stated that he had absolutely been actively, brutally working, incredibly late, entirely in the elite office, meticulously preparing highly complex reports, entirely for the elite investors, completely from Miami, and confidently arrived completely home, highly significantly, completely after absolute midnight, supposedly way too incredibly, highly exhausted to highly possibly actively eat massive dinner. Victoria sat heavily completely down, incredibly heavily, entirely on the highly plush armchair, entirely in the massive closet. The highly damning receipt absolutely still firmly in her violently trembling soft hands, profoundly feeling exactly as if the entire massive world had completely, violently tilted completely on its massive axis. Absolutely all the highly terrifying suspicions. Absolutely all the highly toxic signs she had highly desperately attempted to highly rationally rationalize or highly pathetically ignore. Highly suddenly, completely crystallized, completely into a highly undeniable, highly painful, absolute truth. Victoria found the receipt. Who do you think she should call first for advice? A lawyer, a friend, or Julian? Tell us below. The highly sharp sound entirely of the expensive phone, violently ringing highly violently, brought her completely back, directly to absolute reality. It was officially Julian Vance, the highly elite corporate partner entirely of Richard. Highly ironically, exactly one entirely of the absolute, only highly true, genuine friends she absolutely still highly successfully possessed. Victoria, my highly beautiful dear. His highly warm, highly deeply concerned, deep voice confidently came completely through the highly secure line. Exactly how are you completely actively doing? Julian was absolutely everything that Richard had completely, violently, ceased entirely to absolutely be. Highly incredibly kind, highly attentive, a highly true man, entirely of highly solid, absolute principles, who highly respectfully treated highly normal people completely with highly genuine, absolute respect. At exactly his highly distinguished age, he flawlessly possessed a highly natural, absolute elegance that absolutely did not highly pathetically depend entirely on highly expensive clothes or highly flashy designer accessories. His highly distinguished silver hair, perfectly at the highly sharp temples, and his highly expressive lines, entirely of highly experienced expression, loudly spoke entirely of a highly true man, who had highly fully lived completely, with highly absolute purpose and pure integrity. Julian, Victoria violently hesitated, highly desperately frantically containing the hot tears that aggressively threatened to completely violently overflow. Do you successfully possess a highly few short minutes? I highly desperately need to actively talk completely with absolutely someone. Absolutely always, he firmly responded completely immediately. I am highly actively completely on my absolute way. Exactly 40 highly agonizing minutes, significantly later. Victoria successfully found completely herself, entirely, in the highly massive living room, smoothly pouring hot coffee, completely for Julian. Entirely, while she highly desperately attempted to miraculously find the absolute right heavy words, entirely to highly accurately express the highly violent storm entirely of highly massive emotions that was aggressively lashing her fragile heart. He intensely observed her completely with those highly compassionate, warm brown eyes, highly patiently, actively waiting entirely for her to miraculously find the highly absolute courage, entirely to bravely speak. Julian, she softly began, her beautiful voice literally barely a highly fragile whisper. Do you profoundly know absolutely anything highly massive entirely about Richard? Absolutely anything highly terrifying that I absolutely should explicitly know? The highly heavy silence that violently followed was a highly absolute, highly complete answer, completely sufficient, entirely in itself. She vividly saw the highly massive pain flawlessly reflected entirely in the highly handsome face entirely of Julian. The highly violent internal struggle completely between highly toxic loyalty completely to his elite partner and highly genuine, pure concern entirely for her. He finally confidently spoke, his deep voice incredibly heavy, completely with absolute sadness. How incredibly long have we absolutely been highly loyal friends? Significantly over exactly 10 agonizing years, she softly replied. Completely, since significantly, completely, before my highly toxic marriage. Then you profoundly know that I would absolutely never ever maliciously lie completely to you. Lie. Julian smoothly leaned completely forward, completely, with his massive hands highly tightly interlaced. But you absolutely also profoundly know that exactly this is an absolute, completely impossible, highly massive position entirely for me. Victoria highly gently showed him the highly damning restaurant receipt. I successfully found exactly this exactly today. Julian intensely looked directly at the highly cheap paper and tightly closed his piercing eyes, exactly as if he were highly actively physically feeling highly brutal physical pain. When he slowly opened them completely again, there was a highly profound sadness and highly absolute determination entirely in them. Her highly specific name is officially Evelyn Harper, he stated. Absolutely every single heavy word violently coming completely out, completely with highly massive difficulty. She is exactly 25 young years old. She is officially a highly junior marketing consultant. She has absolutely been brutally working completely with US entirely for exactly around 6 agonizing months. Victoria physically felt exactly as if she had literally just been highly brutally punched completely in the heavy stomach. Clearly hearing the highly absolute confirmation entirely of her absolute worst, highly terrifying suspicions was absolutely even significantly more highly painful than she had absolutely ever highly actively imagined. How incredibly long has exactly this absolutely been highly actively going completely on? She asked, her beautiful voice almost completely inaudible. I would highly accurately explicitly say that it highly aggressively began exactly 5 agonizing months completely ago, perhaps a highly tiny bit, significantly more. Julian heavily sighed incredibly deeply. Victoria, I highly desperately attempted to actively talk completely with Richard highly multiple massive times. I highly desperately attempted to miraculously make him vividly see the highly absolute madness entirely of exactly what he was highly actively doing, exactly what he was highly dangerously risking. His beautiful family, his pristine reputation, absolutely everything. And exactly what did he highly toxically say? He highly arrogantly explicitly said that I was highly pathetically old-fashioned, that I absolutely did not completely understand the highly complex complexities entirely of highly modern elite life. The highly bitter toxic bitterness entirely in the deep voice entirely of Julian was highly palpable. He highly toxically explicitly said that you were highly pathetically completely content entirely to absolutely be absolutely just a highly pathetic trophy wife. That Evelyn highly aggressively intellectually challenged him. The highly toxic words violently wounded her highly deeply, significantly more highly painful entirely for actively coming completely through Julian, completely from whom she profoundly knew was highly actively attempting to miraculously soften the highly brutal blow. Highly pathetic trophy wife, she highly toxically repeated, highly bitterly tasting the highly toxic words completely on her dry tongue, exactly as if they were highly lethal poison. He is completely, catastrophically wrong, Victoria, Julian firmly stated completely with highly absolute vehemence. Completely, utterly wrong. You are officially exactly one entirely of the absolute most highly intelligent and highly talented, beautiful women I intimately know. The highly absolute fact that you have highly bravely chosen entirely to highly lovingly dedicate completely yourself, entirely to your beautiful family, absolutely, does not highly miraculously diminish your highly absolute, massive value entirely in absolutely and highly pathetic way. Victoria confidently stood completely up and confidently walked directly to the massive window, intensely looking completely out directly at the highly perfectly manicured, beautiful garden that she had completely herself, highly meticulously planned and highly carefully supervised. Absolutely everything, entirely in her massive life, visually seemed highly perfectly flawless, completely on the highly polished outside, but completely on the highly dark inside. It was completely, violently, crumbling completely apart. "Exactly 5 agonizing months," she murmured softly. "Exactly 25 young years old is precisely the highly specific age that Isabella was officially exactly when Richard and I happily married." The highly cruel, toxic irony entirely of the highly complex situation absolutely did not completely pass highly unnoticed. While she highly lovingly built a beautiful life, lovingly created a highly warm home, actively being the highly perfect, flawless wife that he highly apparently desperately wanted, Richard was highly meticulously, aggressively building a highly toxic, completely parallel massive lie. A highly secret toxic life that completely, utterly excluded absolutely everything that they had beautifully promised, highly intimately, to absolutely each other. "Victoria." Julian slowly approached, significantly closer, completely to her. His deep voice incredibly soft, but highly firm. "You highly desperately need to explicitly know exactly one, significantly more, highly massive thing." She smoothly turned completely around, vividly seeing absolutely something highly terrifying entirely in his piercing eyes that actively made her violently fear exactly what would highly violently come completely next. "There is officially a highly exclusive, massive gala event exactly next highly anticipated week. The highly prestigious annual party entirely of the highly elite Manhattan Business Association entirely at the highly exclusive Plaza Hotel. Richard is actively going to absolutely be perfectly there. And," he violently hesitated, highly clearly actively struggling completely with the highly heavy words. "Evelyn will absolutely also highly actively be perfectly there exactly as his highly official elite companion." The entire, massive world entirely of Victoria physically seemed to completely, violently stop. Completely, entirely. She heavily leaned completely against the highly cold windowsill, physically feeling exactly as if her weak legs were completely, violently giving completely out. "Highly official elite companion?" she repeated, her beautiful voice violently coming completely out exactly as a highly muffled whisper. He highly toxically, explicitly told the highly elite specialized press that she is officially his highly elite, brand new strategic partner. That she will absolutely be highly officially presented completely to the highly exclusive business society entirely of massive New York, entirely at exactly this highly exclusive event. Julian aggressively clenched his massive fists, his absolute own, highly justified anger, highly actively manifesting. "Victoria, highly generously forgive me entirely for actively having to absolutely be the exact one who highly explicitly tells you exactly this, but you fiercely deserve to explicitly know." "And exactly me?" she softly asked, absolutely still highly actively processing the highly massive magnitude entirely of the highly brutal betrayal. What exact, highly pathetic excuse did he highly toxically give entirely for my highly suspicious absence? He highly toxically explicitly said that you were highly actively taking absolute care entirely of highly personal, massive family matters. The highly heavy words entirely of Julian violently cut exactly like highly sharp knives. That you highly fiercely prefer to flawlessly maintain your highly private life completely far, far away, entirely from the highly blinding spotlight entirely of highly elite business. Victoria tightly closed her beautiful eyes, physically feeling a highly toxic, lethal mixture entirely of absolute humiliation, white-hot anger, and a massive pain so incredibly, highly deep that it physically seemed highly physical. Richard absolutely wasn't entirely just actively having a highly pathetic affair. He was highly actively, highly aggressively replacing her, violently erasing her highly absolute existence completely from his highly elite public life. For exactly how incredibly long, significantly more, Julian? She sharply asked, smoothly opening her piercing eyes and intensely looking directly at him. For exactly how incredibly long do you genuinely think he highly toxically intends entirely to highly flawlessly maintain exactly this highly pathetic farce? Honestly, I highly genuinely think he actively plans to highly aggressively ask entirely for the highly brutal divorce completely after the highly massive deal, completely with the elite investors completely from Miami, is highly officially finalized. Julian heavily sighed incredibly deeply. Evelyn, she is absolutely not entirely just a highly pathetic mistress, Victoria. She is incredibly ambitious, highly calculating. I highly genuinely think she highly toxically sees you exactly as a highly pathetic stepping stone, entirely to successfully build her absolute own highly elite empire. The highly terrifying revelation was exactly like the absolute, highly final fatal blow. Victoria sat heavily, completely down, entirely on the highly comfortable armchair, highly actively processing absolutely not only the highly tragic end entirely of her beautiful marriage, but the highly cruel and incredibly, highly public toxic way entirely in which it was actively being violently executed. He is actively going to violently leave me completely with absolutely nothing, she murmured softly, significantly more entirely to her absolute own self than completely to Julian. He is actively going to highly maliciously paint me exactly as the highly inadequate, pathetic wife. The highly pathetic woman who absolutely did not profoundly know exactly how to highly successfully accompany his highly massive professional growth. No, absolutely not exactly, if he officially possesses absolutely no, completely other highly viable option, Julian firmly stated. A highly brand new, absolute determination miraculously emerging entirely in his deep voice. Victoria, you are absolutely not the exact same highly vulnerable, pathetic woman who happily married Richard exactly 7 agonizing years completely ago. You have highly miraculously grown, beautifully evolved. You have miraculously become a highly silent but incredibly highly powerful, massive force. It is officially highly massive. Time entirely to flawlessly demonstrate exactly it. She intensely looked directly at him, completely, utterly confused. What exactly do you explicitly mean? You are actively going directly to the highly exclusive gala event. Julian, I absolutely cannot. You absolutely can, and you absolutely will. He highly smoothly, but incredibly firmly interrupted her. Absolutely not exactly, as the highly humiliated, pathetic wife who highly cowardly hides completely at home, but exactly as the highly strong, highly elegant, beautiful woman that you officially or highly actively let Richard and his highly pathetic mistress explicitly know that you are absolutely not actively going to highly cowardly disappear completely in highly pathetic silence. And exactly how do you highly actively suggest that I highly successfully actively do exactly that? The beautiful voice entirely of Victoria heavily carried a highly specific tone, entirely of absolute desperation. I absolutely do not even officially possess a highly exclusive invitation. Julian beautifully smiled entirely for the absolute first time, completely since he confidently arrived. You are actively going exactly as my highly official companion. I am officially a highly elite senior partner entirely in the massive firm. I legally possess the highly absolute right to actively bring absolutely whoever I highly fiercely want. He violently stopped highly significantly. I officially possess absolutely some highly interesting, massive information entirely about the highly questionable, elite commercial practices entirely of Richard that could highly possibly be highly, incredibly enlightening. Julian, I absolutely cannot highly actively ask you to. You are absolutely not highly actively asking. I am highly actively offering. He confidently stood completely up and slowly approached significantly closer, completely to her. Victoria, Richard is absolutely not entirely just violently betraying you. He is absolutely also highly toxically betraying the highly absolute ethical principles entirely of our massive company. There are highly illegal irregular contracts, highly illegal undeclared commissions, a highly massive series entirely of highly illegal activities that could completely, violently destroy our highly pristine reputation exactly if they confidently came completely to absolute light. Are you highly actively talking entirely about highly illegal blackmail? I am highly actively talking entirely about highly absolute justice, Julian smoothly corrected, and entirely about fiercely protecting you and beautiful Isabella completely from exactly what is actively about to violently come. Julian is offering to help Victoria expose Richard. Do you think she should trust him and go to the gala? Tell us below. The metamorphosis. That exact night, completely after Julian confidently left, Victoria successfully found completely herself, entirely in the highly beautiful room, entirely of Isabella, intensely watching her beautiful daughter peacefully sleep completely placidly. The highly pure innocence entirely in the beautiful face, entirely of the young girl, highly brutally contrasted completely with the highly violent storm, entirely of massive emotions that was violently lashing the fragile heart entirely of her loving mother. Mama is actively going to fiercely fight completely for us, my beautiful princess, she whispered incredibly softly, gently kissing the highly soft forehead entirely of her beautiful daughter. I am absolutely not actively going to highly generously let him highly toxically treat us, exactly as if we were highly pathetically disposable. When Richard confidently arrived completely home, exactly that highly specific night, significantly later than absolutely ever completely before, completely with the highly expensive perfume entirely of Evelyn, absolutely still, fiercely clinging, completely, to his pale skin. He highly unexpectedly successfully found Victoria highly patiently waiting, completely for him entirely in the massive living room. But there was absolutely something highly massive, completely different, entirely in her. Absolutely something that he absolutely could not, highly successfully actively identify, completely immediately. Absolutely still completely awake? He sharply asked, exactly as absolutely always. Yes, she stated, her beautiful voice highly surprisingly incredibly calm and completely, flawlessly controlled. We highly desperately need to actively talk. He intensely looked directly at her completely with highly toxic suspicion, highly sharply noticing the highly massive change entirely in her flawless posture, the highly confident way she fiercely held her fragile shoulders incredibly straight, her delicate chin highly proudly high. About exactly what? About the highly exclusive gala event, exactly next highly anticipated week. Victoria confidently stood completely up, completely with absolute grace, smoothly walking directly toward him. I clearly heard that you will highly officially possess a highly special, elite companion. The handsome face entirely of Richard completely, violently paled, incredibly slightly. But he highly rapidly, flawlessly recomposed, completely himself. Victoria, can I highly logically explain? You absolutely do not desperately need to. She smoothly interrupted him, her beautiful voice flawlessly maintaining exactly that, highly disconcerting, absolute calm. In highly absolute fact, I highly genuinely think it will absolutely be a highly revealing, highly massive night, entirely for absolutely everyone, highly actively involved. What exactly do you explicitly mean completely by exactly that? Victoria beautifully smiled. Absolutely not. The highly forced, highly submissive fake smile that he intimately knew. But absolutely something highly brand new. Absolutely something that flawlessly carried a highly dangerous, lethal promise. You will profoundly know entirely in the highly opportune, massive moment, Richard. Good highly night, and completely with exactly that. She confidently climbed the massive stairs, ruthlessly leaving him completely alone, completely with his highly toxic lies, and a highly rapidly growing, terrifying sensation that he had highly, catastrophically, severely underestimated the exact beautiful woman, completely with whom he had happily married. The transformation, the highly agonizing days highly immediately prior, completely to the highly exclusive gala event, were an absolute, highly massive whirlwind, entirely of intense preparation and complete, absolute transformation, entirely for Victoria. For the absolute first time, completely in agonizing years, she highly generously permitted, completely herself, to highly aggressively spend massive money entirely on her absolute own self. Absolutely not entirely just the highly rapid, highly practical, cheap purchases, completely to which she had highly pathetically, completely accustomed, completely herself, but entirely in a highly true, massive investment, entirely in her absolute own, highly pristine image and absolute confidence. On highly anticipated Monday, highly early morning, exactly while Richard was frantically rushing completely out, entirely, for absolutely another, exactly one, entirely of his highly important elite meetings, Victoria rapidly called Eleanor Vance, a highly loyal old friend, completely from elite university, who had miraculously become exactly one entirely of the absolute most highly sought-after elite celebrity stylists, entirely in massive New York. Victoria Sterling! The highly enthusiastic voice entirely of Eleanor loudly resonated completely through the highly secure line, completely full, entirely of massive surprise and highly genuine, pure joy. It has absolutely been so incredibly, highly long. I highly clearly heard that you happily married exactly that highly famous CEO, exactly how his highly elite life entirely in highly exclusive high society. Highly complicated, Victoria honestly responded. Eleanor, I highly desperately need your highly elite help. I highly desperately need an absolute show-stopping designer dress entirely for the highly exclusive gala event entirely of the massive business association. And I highly desperately need to visually look completely, utterly unforgettable. There was a highly pregnant pause, completely on the absolute other side entirely of the highly secure line. And Victoria could miraculously, almost highly clearly, hear the highly complex mechanisms entirely of the highly creative mind, entirely of Eleanor, frantically actively working. What exact specific kind, entirely of unforgettable, are we highly actively talking entirely about perfectly here, my beautiful darling? The highly specific kind that violently stops heavy traffic, or the highly lethal kind that completely, violently destroys highly toxic relationships? The absolute second exactly one, Victoria firmly stated, completely without a single ounce entirely of hesitation. Absolutely perfect. Eleanor smiled highly satisfyingly. I will absolutely be directly at your massive house entirely, in exactly 1 short hour, completely with highly massive options that will highly miraculously make you physically feel exactly like the absolute, highly terrifying goddess that you absolutely always truly were. When Eleanor confidently arrived, heavily accompanied completely by exactly 3 highly efficient elite assistants heavily carrying highly massive designer bags, entirely of highly expensive haute couture clothes and highly exclusive accessories, Victoria profoundly felt exactly as if she were actively entirely about to highly aggressively undergo a completely absolute, total metamorphosis. My beautiful dear, Eleanor stated, intensely studying Victoria completely with highly professional, piercing eyes. You are significantly thinner, and there is a highly massive tension entirely in your fragile shoulders that absolutely was not completely there entirely in elite university. But your piercing eyes successfully possess a highly terrifying fire that I have absolutely never, ever vividly seen completely before. Exactly that is incredibly good. Highly, incredibly good. The highly agonizing following 3 agonizing hours were an absolute, highly transformative, massive experience. Eleanor had highly carefully brought exactly 5 highly stunning designer dresses, absolutely each exactly one, significantly more highly dazzling than the absolute previous one. There was exactly one entirely of a highly deep blood red that highly provocatively hugged absolutely every single highly beautiful curve. Exactly one highly elegant navy blue, completely, with highly expensive crystal details that aggressively exuded highly regal elegance. And exactly one highly sharp black, completely, with a highly structured neckline that was highly simultaneously, incredibly sophisticated, and completely utterly devastating. But it was officially the absolute 5th highly stunning dress that actively made Victoria completely, violently stop actively breathing. It was officially entirely of a highly deep, rich, emerald green. The highly exact same beautiful color exactly as her piercing eyes. Completely with a highly flawless cut that perfectly, flawlessly combined absolute modernity and pure classicism. The highly expensive silk fabric beautifully flowed exactly like liquid water, completely over her flawless body, flawlessly accentuating her beautiful silhouette, completely without actively being highly vulgar. And the highly plunging neckline, entirely in the fragile back, was an absolute, massive work entirely of art, entirely of highly subtle, lethal seduction. Exactly this one, she explicitly stated incredibly simply, intensely looking directly at completely herself, entirely, in the massive mirror. And absolutely no longer vividly seeing the highly neglected, highly submissive, pathetic wife entirely in which she had completely, violently successfully become. But highly clearly seeing the highly strong, incredibly determined, highly powerful, beautiful woman who had absolutely always perfectly been completely underneath the highly pathetic layers entirely of highly toxic submission and highly pathetic self-denial. I profoundly knew you would highly flawlessly choose exactly this, exactly one. Eleanor smiled highly smugly. It is the absolute most highly difficult exactly one, entirely to highly successfully pull completely off. It highly aggressively requires completely absolute, unshakable confidence. But entirely on you, it is actively going to absolutely be completely, utterly devastating. They aggressively spent the absolute rest entirely of the beautiful afternoon highly meticulously choosing highly expensive designer shoes, highly exclusive, massive jewelry, and highly intensively discussing highly complex hairstyle options. Eleanor highly aggressively insisted entirely on highly officially scheduling Victoria completely with her absolute own, highly elite beauty team. Highly exclusive people who brutally worked exclusively completely with massive celebrities and highly famous international supermodels. Victoria, Eleanor softly stated exactly as they highly meticulously organized absolutely everything. Can I highly politely ask exactly what is truly, genuinely, actively, highly happening? You visually seem exactly like a highly terrifying woman, completely on a highly lethal mission. Victoria highly carefully considered entirely for exactly one highly brief moment. Exactly if she absolutely should. Highly openly share the highly sordid, toxic details entirely of her highly complex situation. But absolutely something highly beautiful, entirely in the highly compassionate expression entirely of Eleanor. Highly actively made her fiercely decide, completely entirely for absolute honesty. My highly arrogant husband has absolutely been highly actively having a highly toxic affair entirely for exactly 5 agonizing months. He is actively going to highly proudly take the highly pathetic mistress directly to the highly exclusive gala event, exactly as his highly official corporate business partner. Entirely. While I am highly toxically, officially supposed, entirely to highly pathetically peacefully stay, completely at home, exactly like a highly obedient, pathetic wife. Highly toxically pretending that I profoundly know absolutely nothing. The piercing eyes entirely of Eleanor, completely, violently, narrowed incredibly dangerously. What exact specific kind, entirely of highly pathetic man, highly maliciously, does exactly that, completely to a highly beautiful woman exactly like you? The highly specific kind, who highly toxically, completely forgot that he happily married a highly intelligent, beautiful woman. Absolutely not a highly pathetic, decorative accessory. The beautiful voice entirely of Victoria heavily carried a highly freezing, lethal determination. But he is actively going to highly horrifyingly remember it entirely in a highly incredibly public and highly incredibly memorable, massive way. Excellent. Eleanor smiled completely, with a highly lethal malice that highly beautifully reminded Victoria exactly why they had absolutely been highly close elite friends entirely in elite university. In exactly that highly specific case, we will highly aggressively ensure that you are completely, utterly unforgettable. Victoria is getting a revenge makeover. What is your favorite power outfit that makes you feel unstoppable? Tell us below. The chess pieces move. Meanwhile, entirely in the highly massive corner office entirely of Sterling and Associates, Richard was highly actively having his absolute own, highly massive series, entirely of highly tense, toxic conversations. Julian had highly officially requested a highly private, secure meeting. And Richard could physically, highly clearly, feel the highly absolute disapproval entirely of his elite partner, aggressively emanating completely from him, exactly like highly intense waves entirely of massive heat. "Richard, we highly desperately need to actively talk entirely about Evelyn," Julian stated incredibly directly, highly aggressively closing the heavy door entirely of the massive office. "Julian, we have absolutely already highly actively talked entirely about exactly this. She is officially a highly competent elite professional and she is highly illegally actively collecting highly unauthorized massive commissions completely from the highly elite clients, completely from Miami." Julian violently interrupted him. "I highly successfully found highly massive discrepancies entirely in the highly complex corporate contracts that she highly independently drafted. Highly massive commissions that actively go highly directly straight completely into a highly secure private account entirely of hers." Richard physically felt exactly as if the hot blood completely, violently froze entirely in his weak veins. "What exactly the hell are you actively talking entirely about?" Julian violently threw a highly thick black folder completely onto the massive table. "Exactly 3 highly different complex contracts, absolutely all entirely with highly illegal clauses that she highly maliciously inserted completely without our highly official, absolute authorization. We are highly actively talking entirely about significantly more than $250,000 entirely in highly illegal, massive, irregular commissions. This absolutely must fiercely be a highly pathetic misunderstanding. You are actively being highly maliciously used, Richard," Julian stated, his deep voice completely full entirely of highly pathetic pity and massive frustration. "Evelyn absolutely is not highly genuinely interested entirely in you. She is highly aggressively interested entirely in your highly elite position, your highly exclusive access completely to massive clients, your highly official signature completely on highly lucrative contracts. You are highly toxically exaggerating entirely because you absolutely never, ever highly genuinely liked her. I am highly desperately attempting to miraculously save our massive company and your highly pristine, elite reputation," Julian violently retorted, "and highly additionally, completely by the highly specific way, perhaps miraculously save your highly fragile marriage completely too." Richard violently stood completely up, highly abruptly, confidently walking directly toward the highly massive window, perfectly overlooking the highly elite financial center entirely of massive New York. The massive city beautifully stretched completely out perfectly before him, a highly powerful symbol entirely of absolutely everything he had highly successfully conquered, absolutely everything he had highly meticulously built. The highly terrifying idea that he could highly possibly completely, violently lose absolutely everything entirely for a highly pathetic woman who highly possibly absolutely didn't even truly, genuinely love him was completely, utterly unbearable. "What exactly do you highly aggressively want me entirely to actively do?" he finally, highly exhaustedly asked, his deep voice completely defeated. "Highly publicly, completely end it, completely with her, entirely at the highly exclusive gala event. Highly explicitly make it incredibly clear that there was an absolute, highly massive misunderstanding entirely about her highly official status, entirely in the massive company. Confidently return completely home, directly to your loyal wife, and highly desperately attempt to miraculously rebuild exactly what can absolutely still be highly successfully saved. And exactly if I absolutely do not, Julian heavily sighed incredibly deeply. Then I will highly aggressively be completely, violently, forced, entirely to highly officially present exactly this, highly damning evidence, directly to the highly elite board of directors, entirely of the massive association. Richard, our highly pristine corporate commercial reputation is actively, highly dangerously at massive stake. I absolutely cannot highly generously permit exactly this to highly toxically continue. That exact night, Richard confidently arrived completely home significantly earlier than highly usual, highly unexpectedly finding Victoria peacefully, entirely in the massive living room, highly quietly reading a heavy book. There was absolutely something incredibly different, entirely, in her, a highly profound, beautiful serenity that he had absolutely not vividly seen entirely in agonizing years. Exactly as if she had highly fiercely made a highly massive, absolute decision. He slowly began completely by sitting heavily perfectly, next completely to her, entirely on the expensive sofa. Can we actively talk? She highly meticulously marked the highly specific page entirely of the heavy book and intensely looked directly at him, her piercing green eyes incredibly calm, but highly, fiercely alert. Absolutely, of course, about the highly exclusive gala event. He violently hesitated, highly desperately searching entirely for the absolute right, perfect heavy words. Perhaps you absolutely should confidently go completely with me, completely after absolutely all. Exactly as my highly official, loyal wife. Victoria intensely studied him entirely for a highly long, profound moment. And Richard profoundly felt incredibly highly uncomfortable, completely under her highly penetrating, piercing gaze. Richard, is there absolutely anything highly massive that you would highly desperately like to explicitly tell me? What exactly are you actively talking entirely about? About Evelyn. Entirely about exactly what is highly genuinely, truly actively happening completely between the exactly two entirely of you. Richard physically felt his massive heart violently accelerate. Exactly how did she profoundly know? What exactly did she profoundly know? Richard, you absolutely do not desperately need to highly pathetically explain right exactly now, she stated, gracefully standing completely up. Exactly as you highly previously explicitly stated, absolutely some highly massive revelations are significantly better, highly efficiently made, entirely in the highly opportune, massive moment. I will absolutely vividly see you entirely at the highly exclusive gala event, Richard. It is actively going to absolutely be an incredibly, highly interesting, massive night. And entirely for the absolute second, highly terrifying time, exactly that highly specific week, she confidently left him completely alone, completely with his highly toxic lies, and a highly rapidly growing, terrifying sensation that he had completely, utterly lost absolute control entirely of the highly explosive situation. Julian gave Richard an ultimatum. Do you think Richard will actually dump Evelyn or try to scheme his way out? Tell us your thoughts. The Queen's arrival. The highly anticipated day entirely of the highly exclusive event. Victoria violently woke completely up, completely with a highly supernatural, absolute calm. She had peacefully slept incredibly profoundly, entirely for the absolute first time, completely in agonizing months. And she profoundly felt exactly like a highly terrifying, absolute warrior, highly meticulously preparing completely for the absolute most highly important, massive battle entirely of her entire life. Isabella happily spent the highly beautiful day entirely at the highly secure house entirely of her highly loving maternal grandmother, completely, flawlessly protected, completely from exactly what was highly actively about to violently happen. Victoria had highly carefully explicitly explained completely to the innocent girl that Mama officially possesses a highly important, massive party to confidently go directly to, and that they would highly happily possess a highly special, beautiful day, completely together, completely, during the highly fun weekend entirely, to miraculously compensate entirely for it. At exactly 3 p.m., the highly elite team entirely of Eleanor confidently arrived entirely to highly aggressively begin the highly absolute final transformation. During the highly agonizing following exactly 4 highly intense hours, Victoria was highly meticulously molded, flawlessly polished, and completely, violently transformed. Absolutely not entirely, only completely, into a significantly more highly glamorous, beautiful version entirely of completely herself, but completely into the highly powerful, terrifying woman who had absolutely been peacefully sleeping, completely inside, entirely of her, entirely, for agonizing years. Her beautiful hair was flawlessly styled, entirely in highly sophisticated, timeless 1940s Hollywood-style waves. Her highly expensive makeup beautifully enhanced her piercing green eyes, entirely in a highly dramatic but incredibly elegant way. Completely with a highly classic, bold red lipstick that highly lethally promised to completely leave its highly indelible mark, completely on absolutely everything it highly actively touched. The highly stunning emerald dress flawlessly hugged her flawless body, exactly like a highly perfect second skin. And the highly dangerously tall high heels actively made her physically feel exactly like a highly terrifying Amazon. Completely, utterly, ready entirely for massive war. When she intensely looked directly at the massive mirror, entirely, for the absolute last highly specific time, completely before confidently leaving, Victoria absolutely no longer vividly saw the highly neglected, highly submissive, pathetic wife, entirely into which she had completely, violently, successfully become. But the highly strong, incredibly determined, highly powerful, beautiful woman she had absolutely always perfectly been, and who was actively about to highly proudly reclaim her highly absolute place entirely in the massive world. The highly luxurious Plaza Hotel was completely, utterly resplendent, exactly that highly crisp October night. The highly bright golden lights entirely of the highly neoclassical facade flawlessly created a highly majestic, beautiful glow that beautifully reflected entirely in the highly expensive luxury cars that confidently arrived entirely in a highly constant, endless succession. The highly exclusive annual event entirely of the highly elite Manhattan Business Association was absolutely always the absolute most highly prestigious, elite event, entirely of the highly exclusive social and corporate business calendar, entirely of the massive city, flawlessly gathering the absolute highest business elite, highly influential politicians, and highly famous media personalities. Richard confidently arrived at exactly 8 p.m., impeccably dressed entirely in a highly bespoke Armani tuxedo, completely with Evelyn perfectly on his broad arm. She flawlessly wore a highly stunning, golden designer dress that brilliantly shimmered completely under the bright lights. Her highly beautiful blonde hair flawlessly styled entirely in a highly sophisticated, elegant bun. At exactly 25 young years old, Evelyn Harper seamlessly possessed a highly calculated, toxic beauty. Absolutely every single, highly specific gesture. Absolutely every single toxic smile. Absolutely every single highly calculated movement actively seemed highly meticulously planned, entirely, to highly successfully cause the highly absolute maximum massive impact. "You are incredibly nervous," she highly astutely observed, exactly as they confidently walked completely down the highly exclusive red carpet, highly toxically greeting aggressive photographers and highly specialized journalists. "Absolutely just highly focused," Richard smoothly replied, but his massive hand violently tightening completely on her fragile arm highly blatantly betrayed his highly toxic tension. "Deeply remember, you are officially my highly elite brand new strategic partner, highly strictly responsible entirely for highly massive international expansion. Absolutely nothing significantly more. Absolutely nothing significantly less." Evelyn beautifully smiled, but there was absolutely something incredibly sharp and highly lethal entirely in her piercing eyes. "Absolutely, of course, my beautiful darling. Absolutely whatever you highly fiercely want." The highly grand, massive ballroom entirely of the luxury hotel was flawlessly decorated completely with a highly refined, absolute elegance. Highly beautiful white and golden exotic flowers, entirely in highly monumental arrangements. Highly massive crystal chandeliers that beautifully created a highly dazzling, intricate play entirely of bright lights. And highly elegant tables highly strategically arranged entirely to highly flawlessly favor highly smooth circulation and highly important corporate business conversations. Richard and Evelyn were highly immediately aggressively surrounded completely by completely other highly powerful businessmen, elite journalists, and highly important personalities. Richard highly proudly presented Evelyn completely with the highly rehearsed toxic speech entirely about her highly elite professional competence and highly brilliant strategic vision. But he absolutely could not highly successfully help but actively notice the highly speculative, highly toxic glances they highly discreetly exchanged completely between absolutely themselves. The highly exclusive high society entirely of massive New York was incredibly small. And absolutely, everyone profoundly knew that Richard was highly legally married. Edward Sierra, the highly powerful president entirely of the massive association, confidently approached completely with a highly political, fake smile. "What an absolute, massive pleasure to vividly see you perfectly here. And exactly this, absolutely, must officially be the highly famous Evelyn entirely, of whom we have absolutely clearly heard so incredibly much." "Edward, absolutely always a massive pleasure." Richard smoothly extended his massive hand. "Yes, she is officially Evelyn Harper, our highly elite brand new director entirely of international expansion." "Highly fascinating," Edward stated, but his piercing eyes heavily carried a highly toxic curiosity that confidently went significantly, infinitely further than absolutely purely professional. "And your loyal wife, Richard? It has absolutely been a highly incredibly long massive time completely since we vividly saw her entirely in highly public events." Richard physically felt a highly tight knot violently form completely in his heavy stomach. "Victoria highly fiercely prefers to actively take absolute care entirely of highly personal family matters. You profoundly know exactly how she absolutely is." "Absolutely, of course," Edward fiercely nodded. but there was a highly strange, toxic weirdness entirely in his deep tone that actively made Richard profoundly feel incredibly highly uncomfortable. On the absolute other side entirely of the massive room, perfectly near the highly grand main entrance, Julian Vance highly nervously checked his expensive watch entirely for the highly agonizing 10th time entirely in exactly 5 short minutes. It was exactly 8:40 p.m., and Victoria absolutely still had absolutely not successfully arrived. He was highly aggressively actively beginning to highly anxiously wonder exactly if she had highly cowardly changed her highly brilliant mind. If the highly absolute courage she had flawlessly shown completely during the highly agonizing week had finally, completely, violently abandoned her. It was exactly then that the highly sophisticated conversations entirely in the massive room aggressively began to highly gradually, completely, violently die completely out. Exactly like highly massive ripples aggressively spreading completely across a highly quiet lake. Highly arrogant heads completely, violently turned directly toward the highly grand entrance. Highly toxic whispers aggressively began to violently circulate. And absolutely even the highly elegant orchestra actively seemed to highly respectfully play significantly more highly softly. Exactly as if highly instinctively recognizing that absolutely something completely, utterly extraordinary was highly actively about to violently happen. Victoria Sterling had officially arrived. She flawlessly appeared perfectly at the absolute top entirely of the highly sweeping marble staircase that beautifully descended directly into the highly grand main hall, and entirely for a highly massive moment that physically felt completely, utterly eternal. Massive time simply completely, violently stopped. The highly stunning emerald dress beautifully flowed completely around her flawless body, exactly like liquid water, flawlessly catching and beautifully reflecting the highly bright lights entirely of the massive chandeliers, entirely in a highly, almost highly magical way. Her highly terrifying posture was exactly that entirely of an absolute, untouchable queen. Broad shoulders incredibly straight, delicate chin highly proudly high, and those piercing green eyes that had absolutely always perfectly been her highly beautiful trademark, exactly now brilliantly shown completely with a highly terrifying intensity that actively seemed to highly miraculously illuminate the absolute entire massive room. She gracefully descended the highly steep steps, incredibly slowly. Absolutely every single highly calculated movement flawlessly designed entirely for highly absolute, maximum massive impact. There was absolutely no massive rush, absolutely no toxic anxiety. Absolutely only a highly absolute, unshakable confidence that aggressively radiated completely from her, exactly like a highly palpable, massive aura. The highly heavy silence entirely in the massive room was miraculously almost completely deafening. Exactly 200 highly powerful people, elite CEOs, highly influential politicians, wealthy socialites, elite journalists. Absolutely everyone, completely, violently, dropped exactly what they were highly actively doing entirely to intensely see exactly this highly dazzling, beautiful woman who had highly miraculously appeared exactly like a highly terrifying vision. My absolute God. Absolutely, someone whispered incredibly softly, perfectly near the grand entrance. Who exactly is she? She is officially the loyal wife entirely of Richard Sterling. The highly shocked, whispered response rapidly arrived. Victoria Sterling, It has absolutely been agonizing years completely since we vividly saw her entirely and highly public. Victoria has finally arrived, and everyone is staring. How do you think Richard will react when he sees her? Drop your guesses. The execution of the farce. Richard, who was actively entirely in the absolute center entirely of the massive room, highly enthusiastically talking completely with a highly elite group, entirely of massive investors, physically felt a highly freezing chill violently run completely down his strong spine, completely before absolutely even actively turning completely around. There was absolutely something highly massive, entirely in the highly specific quality entirely of the dead silence, in the highly specific way that absolutely all highly sophisticated conversations had completely, violently ceased. That highly aggressively actively made his highly primal survival instinct highly loudly ring absolutely all the highly terrifying alarms. When he finally smoothly turned completely around and vividly saw her, his handsome face completely, violently, paled highly visibly. This absolutely was not the highly submissive, highly neglected, pathetic wife he had highly toxically left completely at home, entirely for agonizing months. This was officially a highly completely transformed, beautiful woman. A highly terrifying force, entirely of absolute nature, entirely in highly perfect human form. And she was confidently walking highly directly, completely straight directly, toward him. Evelyn smoothly followed the highly terrified gaze entirely of Richard, and physically felt her absolute own heavy stomach violently clench. She had absolutely vividly seen highly old photos entirely of Victoria, highly old pictures completely from highly outdated social events, absolutely some highly casual images that Richard highly carelessly possessed entirely on his expensive phone. But absolutely nothing, completely, utterly nothing, had highly successfully prepared her entirely for the highly magnetic, absolute presence entirely of the highly terrifying woman who exactly now completely, utterly dominated the highly intense attention entirely of absolutely everyone, entirely in the massive room. "Richard," Evelyn whispered incredibly softly, her toxic voice completely full, entirely of a highly massive insecurity that she highly rarely ever actively showed. "Is exactly that officially her?" Richard literally could not successfully respond. He was completely, utterly hypnotized, completely by the highly terrifying vision entirely of his loyal wife. A loyal wife he had highly toxically neglected, highly maliciously underestimated, and violently betrayed. Confidently walking directly toward him completely, with the highly absolute confidence, entirely, of a highly terrifying warrior goddess, Victoria confidently reached exactly where they were confidently standing, and the highly elite circle entirely of massive businessmen that heavily surrounded them, highly automatically, smoothly opened, entirely to highly respectfully, generously let her seamlessly pass, exactly as if they highly instinctively recognized that they were officially, entirely in the highly massive presence entirely of absolutely someone, completely, utterly extraordinary. "Richard," she stated, her beautiful voice incredibly soft, but heavily loaded completely with a highly massive authority that highly aggressively actively made absolutely everyone completely present, completely, violently shut, completely up, completely, entirely. What an absolute massive surprise entirely to successfully find you perfectly here. She smoothly turned completely toward Evelyn, intensely studying her completely with a highly piercing gaze that was entirely at once highly evaluative and completely, utterly impassive. "And you absolutely must officially be Evelyn Harper. I have absolutely clearly heard incredibly, highly much entirely about you." Evelyn frantically attempted to highly toxically smile. She frantically attempted to miraculously find exactly that highly calculated toxic confidence that had absolutely always perfectly served her incredibly well. But absolutely something highly massive entirely in the highly freezing gaze entirely of Victoria, highly aggressively actively, made her profoundly feel exactly like a highly pathetic little girl actively being highly strictly evaluated completely by a highly terrifying adult. Yes, I am officially Evelyn," she highly miraculously managed to successfully say. "I brutally work completely with Richard entirely in highly complex international expansion." "How incredibly, highly fascinating," Victoria stated, her highly freezing tone flawlessly remaining completely, perfectly cordial. "International expansion. Richard absolutely always successfully possessed so incredibly much highly passionate passion, entirely for highly brand new, massive territories." The highly lethal insinuation absolutely did not completely pass, highly unnoticed, completely, by absolutely anyone, entirely in the highly curious circle, intensely observing them. Highly numerous elite businessmen, highly nervously exchanged, highly significant, toxic glances. And significantly, more than exactly, one highly aggressive journalist highly discreetly, actively activated the highly secure recorder entirely of their expensive cell phone. Victoria. Richard finally highly miraculously found his deep voice, although it violently came completely out significantly more highly hoarse than he highly actively intended. "What exactly are you actively doing exactly here?" She beautifully smiled exactly then. "Absolutely not," the highly forced, highly submissive fake smile that he intimately knew. But absolutely something highly brand new. Absolutely something that flawlessly carried a highly dangerous, lethal promise. "I am officially right here, exactly as the highly official elite companion entirely of Julian. Highly naturally. You absolutely do not highly toxically mind. I highly genuinely hope. Completely after absolutely all. I am absolutely also, highly officially, a massive part entirely of the highly massive Sterling corporate family." It was exactly then that Julian confidently appeared perfectly at her soft side, highly politely, highly generously offering her his strong arm, entirely in a highly chivalrous, elegant manner. He was highly elegantly dressed, but it was the highly protective, absolute way entirely in which he confidently positioned completely himself, perfectly, next, completely to Victoria, that highly aggressively actively made Richard profoundly feel a highly sharp pang, entirely of absolutely something that could highly possibly absolutely have been highly toxic jealousy. "Good highly evening, Richard," Julian stated, his deep voice flawlessly maintaining highly polite, professional cordiality, but his piercing eyes heavily carrying a highly freezing coldness that Richard had absolutely never, ever vividly seen completely before. "Evelyn, Julian," Richard slowly responded, his brilliant mind actively working highly furiously, entirely, to profoundly understand the highly complex dynamics entirely of the highly explosive situation. "I absolutely did not completely know that you and Victoria, Julian and I are highly loyal, incredibly old elite friends," Victoria smoothly replied completely before Julian could successfully speak. "It is incredibly, highly comforting entirely to successfully possess highly true, genuine friends. Don't you highly genuinely think? Highly pure people, entirely, in whom absolutely one can completely, highly blindly trust absolutely entirely. The highly heavy word trust violently dropped exactly like a highly lethal bomb, entirely in the absolute middle, entirely of the highly tense conversation. Richard physically felt exactly as if absolutely all the hot blood, completely, violently, drained entirely from his handsome face. And Evelyn, highly instinctively cowardly, took exactly one massive step, significantly closer completely to him, exactly as if highly desperately seeking highly pathetic protection. "Well," Edward Sierra confidently appeared completely again, highly clearly physically feeling the highly toxic tension entirely in the heavy air, but highly aggressively determined, entirely, to flawlessly maintain the highly polite cordiality entirely of the massive event. What an absolute, highly wonderful, massive thing entirely to successfully possess the absolute entire, highly elite, sterling corporate family perfectly here, exactly tonight. Victoria, you visually look completely, utterly devastating. It has absolutely been so incredibly, highly long. Thank you so incredibly much, Edward. Victoria smiled radiantly, highly warmly, completely at him. It is incredibly good to absolutely be completely back. Back, Richard highly involuntarily, highly pathetically repeated. In highly elite social events, my beautiful darling, Victoria stated, intensely looking completely directly entirely into his highly terrified eyes. I profoundly realized that I was highly tragically, violently missing highly incredibly many massive things, completely by highly pathetically peacefully staying completely at home. So incredibly many highly interesting complex conversations. So incredibly many highly massive revelations. The highly elegant orchestra aggressively began to beautifully play a highly classic, sweeping waltz. And the massive room highly gradually, highly successfully resumed its highly sophisticated activities, although highly many piercing eyes were absolutely still, highly discreetly, completely focused, entirely on the highly explosive drama actively unfolding, entirely in the absolute center entirely of the massive dance floor. Victoria, Julian gently extended his massive hand. Would you highly fiercely like to beautifully dance? I would highly absolutely love to, she smoothly replied, highly happily accepting his strong hand completely without absolutely even actively looking entirely at Richard. As they confidently headed directly to the massive dance floor, Richard remained completely standing perfectly still, intensely observing his loyal wife, a loyal wife that he highly suddenly, horrifyingly realized that perhaps he had absolutely never, ever, truly, genuinely, completely known. Beautifully dancing completely, with highly absolute grace, entirely in the strong arms, entirely of his elite partner. Every single highly elegant movement entirely of hers was incredibly elegant, highly confident, magnetically, completely attractive. It was completely, medically impossible, absolutely not, to intensely look entirely at her, completely impossible, absolutely not, to physically feel completely violently drawn completely to her highly transformed, absolute presence. Are you perfectly okay, my beautiful darling? Evelyn whispered incredibly softly, perfectly by his broad side. Her toxic voice completely full, entirely of highly pathetic insecurity. Perhaps we absolutely should highly rapidly leave, but Richard literally could not physically move. He was completely, utterly, fascinated completely, by the highly terrifying woman perfectly on the massive dance floor. A beautiful woman he had highly toxically, highly arrogantly, taken completely for highly granted, entirely for agonizing years. A beautiful woman who was exactly now highly aggressively, flawlessly, showing him, and absolutely everyone completely present, exactly, precisely exactly, what he had completely, violently lost. And the highly explosive night was absolutely, only highly actively, beginning. Victoria and Julian are dancing in front of Richard and Evelyn. Do you think Richard is starting to regret his affair? Tell us below. The checkmate. The highly sweeping waltz gracefully came completely to a highly beautiful end. But Victoria and Julian highly peacefully remained perfectly on the massive dance floor entirely, for a highly few short measures significantly more, actively talking entirely in highly soft whispers that visually seemed incredibly intimate and highly conspiratorial. Richard intensely observed absolutely every single highly elegant gesture, absolutely every single beautiful smile, absolutely every single highly intimate moment entirely of pure closeness, completely between them, completely, with a highly terrifying intensity that violently bordered completely on highly toxic obsession. "Are you perfectly okay?" Julian asked incredibly quietly. His warm hand absolutely still, highly gently positioned perfectly on her fragile waist. "Significantly better than I have absolutely been entirely in agonizing years," Victoria honestly replied. "And entirely for the absolute first time entirely in agonizing months." She highly genuinely, truly meant it. "Thank you so incredibly much entirely for highly generously giving me the highly absolute courage entirely to actively be perfectly here." The highly absolute courage was absolutely always completely there, Victoria. You absolutely only highly generously let it peacefully sleep entirely for a highly brief while. When they confidently returned directly to the highly exclusive social area, they successfully found Richard completely alone. Evelyn had completely disappeared, highly likely directly to the highly expensive restroom, highly desperately attempting to miraculously recompose completely herself and highly meticulously plan her highly anticipated next toxic move. Richard. Victoria confidently approached him completely with exactly that, exact same, highly disconcerting, absolute calm. "Can we actively talk completely and highly private?" Richard nodded fiercely. Completely, utterly incapable entirely of highly arrogantly refusing. There was absolutely something highly massive entirely in her absolute presence that completely, violently magnetized him, absolutely entirely. They confidently headed directly to exactly one entirely of the highly exclusive private side terraces entirely of the luxury hotel. A significantly more highly reserved, quiet space, completely with a highly breathtaking view entirely of the highly illuminated, beautiful gardens entirely of massive New York. Once completely alone, the highly fake veneer entirely of highly polite social cordiality, Ellie completely violently aggressively began to completely crack. "What exactly the hell are you highly actively doing, Victoria?" Richard violently demanded, his deep voice completely full, entirely of massive frustration and pure confusion. "I am actively, highly, simply actively being myself," she smoothly replied, incredibly simply. "Absolutely something that I highly, tragically, completely forgot exactly how to successfully do entirely in the absolute last agonizing years. You profoundly know exactly what I explicitly mean. Exactly this highly dramatic transformation, confidently appearing perfectly here, completely with Julian, highly publicly humiliating me. Humiliating you? Victoria violently interrupted, her piercing green eyes brilliantly shining, incredibly dangerously. Richard, you highly arrogantly brought your highly pathetic mistress directly to a highly public exclusive event, and you highly proudly presented her exactly as your highly elite corporate partner. Who exactly was highly actively humiliating? Exactly who? Richard completely, violently paled. How exactly did you profoundly know? Oh, how exactly do I profoundly know? Victoria confidently took exactly one massive step, significantly closer. And Richard could highly clearly smell her highly expensive perfume. Absolutely not. The highly soft, highly familiar, cheap perfume she had absolutely always previously used. But absolutely something highly brand new, significantly more highly intense, significantly more highly confident. I profoundly know absolutely everything entirely about Le Bernardin. I profoundly know absolutely everything entirely about the exactly 5 agonizing months entirely of highly toxic lies. I profoundly know absolutely everything entirely about the highly malicious plans, entirely, to highly, publicly discard me entirely, while you highly arrogantly elevate Evelyn completely to the highly elite status entirely of your highly pathetic brand new companion. Victoria, I can highly logically explain. You absolutely do not desperately need to, she stated incredibly, surprisingly highly calm. In highly absolute fact, I absolutely should highly profoundly thank you. Thank me? Richard was completely, utterly lost. Yes, you highly aggressively actively did me a highly massive favor completely by highly flawlessly showing me exactly who you truly, genuinely are. Can you highly possibly even imagine exactly if I had horrifyingly discovered exactly this entirely in exactly 10 agonizing years? Completely after actively having highly pathetically wasted absolutely even significantly more entirely of my highly precious life, highly desperately attempting to actively be the highly perfect, flawless wife entirely for a highly toxic man who absolutely did not fiercely deserve absolutely even exactly one single highly pathetic day entirely of my highly pure dedication. The highly heavy words violently wounded Richard significantly, more deeply than he highly possibly absolutely ever miraculously imagined that heavy words highly possibly could. Because entirely somewhere, completely deep, entirely inside, he profoundly knew that she was 100% absolutely right. And Isabella? He highly desperately asked, highly frantically attempting to miraculously recover absolutely some highly pathetic amount, entirely of absolute control, entirely of the highly explosive situation. Isabella is actively going to absolutely be perfectly fine, Victoria firmly replied. She officially possesses a highly strong, loving mother who fiercely loves her completely unconditionally, and who is actively going to fiercely fight completely for her, as entirely for the highly pathetic father. She violently stopped highly significantly. Well, exactly that is actively going to highly, strictly, completely depend entirely on your highly absolute decisions, completely, from exactly now completely on. What exactly do you explicitly mean? I explicitly mean that you officially possess exactly 2 highly viable options, Richard. You can highly logically, actively do exactly this entirely, in a highly civilized, massive manner, highly, fairly completely divide our highly massive assets, highly legally establish a highly fair custody agreement that highly strictly prioritizes the absolute well-being entirely of beautiful Isabella, and highly successfully maintain a highly minimal amount entirely of absolute dignity, entirely in the highly complex process. Or, Victoria beautifully smiled, but there was absolutely zero pure warmth entirely in it. Julian can highly actively fiercely decide to highly publicly share absolutely some incredibly highly interesting, massive information completely with the highly elite board of directors entirely of the massive association, entirely about highly certain, highly illegal financial irregularities, highly actively involving the highly massive contracts entirely from Miami. Richard physically felt exactly as if he had literally just been highly brutally punched, completely in the heavy stomach. You absolutely would not highly actively do exactly that. I absolutely would not. The piercing eyes entirely of Victoria violently narrowed. Richard, you aggressively spent the absolute last 5 agonizing months highly maliciously lying completely to me, violently betraying me, highly publicly humiliating me, and highly meticulously planning entirely to highly ruthlessly discard me exactly as if I were a highly pathetic piece entirely of cheap old furniture. What exactly the hell highly actively makes you highly arrogantly think that you absolutely still fiercely deserve my highly protective protection? In exactly that highly specific moment, Evelyn confidently appeared perfectly at the highly grand entrance entirely of the beautiful terrace, highly clearly actively having highly frantically searched completely for Richard. She had highly meticulously retouched her expensive makeup and highly successfully recomposed her highly elegant posture. But there was absolutely still a highly visible, toxic tension entirely in her fragile shoulders. Richard, my beautiful darling, she stated, highly desperately attempting to actively sound highly casual. Highly important people are highly actively searching completely for you. There are absolutely some highly elite investors who would highly absolutely love to. Evelyn! Victoria smoothly turned completely toward her, completely with a highly lethal smile that was absolute, pure elegance, and absolute, pure, lethal poison. How incredibly, highly wonderful that you are actively right here. I was absolutely just actively talking completely with Richard entirely about highly massive decisions and highly terrifying consequences. Evelyn highly nervously looked completely between Richard and Victoria, highly clearly physically feeling the highly toxic, explosive tension entirely in the heavy air, but completely without highly profoundly understanding its highly absolute origin. You profoundly know, Victoria aggressively continued, confidently walking incredibly slowly completely around Evelyn. Exactly like a highly lethal predator, highly meticulously studying its highly pathetic prey. I highly clearly heard that you are incredibly highly talented, entirely at highly aggressively expanding highly massive territories. Julian explicitly told me absolutely some incredibly fascinating, highly massive things entirely about your highly creative creativity, completely with highly complex international contracts. The beautiful face entirely of Evelyn, completely, violently lost absolutely all its color highly instantly. I honestly do not completely know exactly what you are actively talking entirely about. I am completely, 100% absolutely sure you absolutely do not, Victoria stated incredibly quietly. But I am completely, 100% absolutely sure that the highly strict federal tax audit department entirely of the massive United States would absolutely be incredibly, highly interested entirely in successfully getting to explicitly know, significantly more entirely, about those highly creative, illegal commissions that highly mysteriously magically appeared entirely in highly secure, private offshore accounts. "Richard!" Evelyn violently turned completely toward him. Absolute, blinding panic, aggressively beginning to highly visibly appear entirely in her toxic voice. What exactly the hell is she actively talking entirely about? Richard intensely looked completely between the exactly two beautiful women. His highly loyal wife, completely, violently transformed completely into a highly terrifying, unstoppable, massive force. And his highly toxic mistress, highly suddenly visually looking incredibly, pathetically young, and incredibly, highly vulnerable. For the absolute first time, completely in agonizing months, he aggressively began to vividly see the highly complex situation completely, with highly absolute, terrifying clarity. Evelyn absolutely was not the highly sophisticated, highly independent elite woman he had highly toxically, genuinely thought. She was a highly pathetic, toxic opportunist who had highly maliciously seen entirely in him a highly lucrative opportunity entirely for highly rapid social and highly massive financial ascension. And Victoria was absolutely everything that he had highly toxically, completely forgotten she highly possibly could absolutely be. Highly intelligent, incredibly strong, completely, utterly magnificent. "Evelyn," he finally stated, his deep voice completely, utterly exhausted, "I highly genuinely think you absolutely should highly rapidly leave." "What?" She intensely looked directly at him, exactly as if he had completely, violently lost his brilliant mind. "Richard, you absolutely cannot highly possibly be completely serious. After absolutely everything that we—" "After exactly what?" Victoria softly interrupted incredibly smoothly. "After you highly maliciously used my beautiful family entirely to highly aggressively advance your highly pathetic career. After you highly illegally stole completely from the massive company that my highly arrogant husband meticulously built. After you highly aggressively attempted to violently destroy a beautiful marriage entirely for your absolute own highly toxic benefit. I fiercely love Richard!" Evelyn violently exploded, finally highly actively showing highly genuine, pure emotion. "No," Victoria stated completely with highly unshakable, absolute certainty. "You fiercely love exactly what Richard highly toxically represents. The massive power, the massive money, the highly elite status. But exactly as entirely for Richard, the highly pathetic man, I highly severely doubt that you absolutely, even truly, genuinely know him." Evelyn intensely looked directly at Richard, highly desperately expecting him entirely to fiercely defend her, to highly aggressively deny the highly massive accusations. But he heavily remained completely, utterly silent, and entirely in exactly that highly heavy, deafening silence. She vividly saw the absolute truth. "You are absolutely both actively going to highly agonizingly regret exactly this," she finally stated, her highly fake mask entirely of elite sophistication completely, violently, falling completely apart. "You are absolutely both actively going to highly agonizingly regret it." "Perhaps," Victoria stated incredibly calmly, "but entirely at the absolute very least. We will highly agonizingly regret it completely with absolute dignity. Evelyn violently abandoned the highly beautiful terrace completely with highly rapid, incredibly furious heavy steps, ruthlessly leaving Richard and Victoria completely alone, entirely once again. The highly heavy silence violently stretched completely between them, heavily loaded completely with exactly 7 agonizing years, entirely of highly toxic marriage. Agonizing months entirely of highly brutal betrayal, and the highly inevitable, absolute reality entirely of exactly what was highly actively about to violently come. And exactly now, what? Richard finally softly asked. Exactly now you fiercely choose, Victoria firmly replied. Absolute dignity or complete violent destruction, highly polite cooperation or massive, absolute war, absolute, pure respect or highly public, catastrophic humiliation. Richard intensely looked directly at the highly terrifying woman perfectly in front, entirely of him. His highly loyal wife, the loving mother entirely of his beautiful daughter, the beautiful woman he had highly proudly, fiercely sworn entirely to fiercely love and fiercely protect. And he vividly saw absolutely not only exactly what he had completely violently lost, but exactly what he had absolutely never, ever, truly, genuinely appreciated. Victoria, he stated, his deep voice violently breaking incredibly slightly. I absolutely didn't, she softly interrupted incredibly smoothly. Absolutely not exactly now, Richard. Absolutely some highly heavy words completely, violently, through their highly massive power, exactly when they are explicitly said, way too incredibly, catastrophically, late. You highly aggressively actively made your highly toxic decision exactly 5 agonizing months completely ago. Exactly now. I am highly actively making completely mine. She smoothly turned completely around entirely to confidently leave, but completely stopped perfectly at the highly grand entrance entirely of the beautiful terrace. Oh, and Richard, the absolute next massive time you highly arrogantly fiercely choose a beautiful woman, fiercely ensure that she fiercely loves you entirely for the highly pathetic man that you truly are. Absolutely not entirely for exactly what you highly legally possess. You highly fiercely deserve exactly that. And she absolutely does, highly completely too, and completely with exactly those highly heavy words. Victoria Sterling confidently left the beautiful terrace and the highly pathetic life entirely of Richard completely, permanently, forever, ruthlessly leaving him completely, utterly alone, completely with his highly toxic decisions and his highly catastrophic, massive consequences. What an absolutely incredible, breathtaking ending to a highly explosive story. Do you fiercely think Victoria made the absolute right, perfect decision? Would you have highly generously forgiven Richard? Drop your fierce thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to smash that like button. Share this incredible story of ultimate karma, and subscribe to our channel for more explosive, satisfying stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.